My name is Josiah. I am 31 years old. And in the summer of 1855, I stood on a wooden block in the middle of Lumpkin's Alley, Richmond, Virginia, barefoot, wrists bound, sweat running down my spine like a slow confession, while men in linen suits placed bets on my body like I was a racehorse. But here is what none of them understood. I was not afraid, not even close. When the auctioneer's voice cracked the humid air and the bids climbed past $10,000, I looked straight into Harrison Whitmore's eyes, and I smiled, because the moment that hammer struck $20,000, it wasn't me who lost my freedom. It was him. He just didn't know it yet. If this already has your heart racing, you're not alone. Every week I share stories like this one, real, forgotten, and powerful. Hit that subscribe button, because your support helps my family keep these stories alive and food on our table. And tell me, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. There are things I need to tell you, things that will make you question everything you think you know about power, about ownership, about what a man truly is. What happened inside that white-columned mansion on Grace Street wasn't just a story of survival. It was something older, something that moves in the dark between history and reckoning. I carried a secret into that house that Harrison Whitmore could never have prepared for. And before the autumn fog rolled over the James River, that secret would bring down everything he had built. Every lie, every stolen fortune, every buried bone. But first, you need to understand where I came from and what I was made of. Richmond in the summer smelled like iron and rot. The James River carried the stench of industry and something darker, something the city refused to name out loud. Lumpkin's Alley sat at the bottom of a hill, a compound of brick and mud where human beings were stored like livestock before sale. I had been there 3 weeks before the auction. 3 weeks sleeping on straw that pricked through my shirt, listening to the sound of men weeping quietly so the guards wouldn't hear. The sky above those walls was a narrow stripe of white, like a scar. The heat pressed down without mercy. And yet, even there, even in that place designed to break a man's spirit before his body could be sold, I kept my eyes open. I watched. I memorized every face, every habit, every weakness. My days in that alley followed a cruel rhythm. At dawn, we were made to stand, to walk, to demonstrate our strength for the traders who came with their leather notebooks and cold eyes. They checked our teeth like we were horses. They pressed fingers against our arms and backs, calculating value in silence. I had learned long before Richmond that the only protection I had was information. So while they examined me, I examined them. I noted who drank too much before noon, who flinched when a name was mentioned, who owed money to whom. Knowledge was the only currency that could not be confiscated, and I had been collecting it since I was old enough to understand that the world I was born into was built entirely on carefully maintained lies. But beneath all of that, beneath the discipline and the strategy, there was a wound that never fully closed. I had a mother once, not a myth, not a memory reduced to smoke and silence, but a real woman with real hands who braided my hair and whispered stories in the dark. They took her when I was 9 years old, sold her on a Tuesday morning, like the day itself meant nothing. I watched the wagon carry her away down a red dirt road, and I made myself a promise standing in that dust. I would not spend my life mourning what was taken. I would spend it making sure the people who built their comfort on our suffering understood, fully and completely, the weight of what they had done. That promise was still burning inside me the morning Harrison Whitmore raised his hand and bought me. The morning they brought me into Whitmore Manor, the sun was cutting through the magnolia trees in long golden blades. The house was enormous, white columns, black shutters, a porch that wrapped around the entire front, like arms trying to hold something together that was already falling apart. A butler named Ezra met us at the gate. His eyes found mine for exactly 1 second, and in that second I saw it. The quiet devastation of a man who had survived by becoming invisible. Harrison Whitmore stood on the top step in a cream-colored suit, pocket watch in hand, looking at me the way a man looks at a painting he overpaid for, but refuses to admit was a mistake. He nodded once, slowly, like a king receiving tribute. That nod told me everything I needed to know about his pride, and exactly how to use it against him. He introduced me to his wife, Catherine, at dinner that same evening. She sat at the far end of a mahogany table long enough to hold 12 people, though only the 2 of them dined. She didn't look at me directly, not at first. She moved her fork with the mechanical precision of someone performing a role they had rehearsed for so long, it no longer required thought. But then I spoke. Just 1 sentence, responding to Harrison's command to describe my previous household. My voice filled that dining room like something the walls hadn't been prepared for. And Catherine looked up. Her eyes, pale, careful, exhausted, met mine. And for just a moment, the mask slipped. She was not a woman at peace. She was a woman waiting for something to finally break. That night, lying on a narrow cot in the servants' quarters, I heard it. The sound of paper burning. A thin, bitter smell threading through the hallway gap under my door. I had been told by Ezra, in careful whispers while carrying trunks upstairs, that Catherine burned documents regularly. Letters, ledgers, folded notes sealed with wax. Always late at night, always alone. I lay still in the dark, and I thought about what a woman burns when she believes no one is watching. Not love letters, not recipes. She burns evidence. She burns the proof of things that, if discovered, would destroy what little ground she still stood on. In that moment, I understood that the Whitmore house was not a home. It was a structure held together entirely by secrets, and I had just moved in. Within the first week, Harrison made his intentions clear. He wanted me visible, displayed. He brought business associates through the house and positioned me near the entrance like an ornament, a living symbol of his wealth and taste. Men in tall hats and polished boots would stop, study my face, and murmur things just below the threshold of full sentences. I heard the word remarkable more times than I could count. Harrison fed on their envy like it was sustenance. But one man was different. A lawyer named Aldrich Kane, thin, dry-voiced, with eyes that moved too quickly and settled on nothing, pulled Harrison aside after one of these displays and spoke in a low, urgent tone. I caught only fragments. The words deed, creditors, and untenable position floated toward me like smoke. Harrison's jaw tightened. Kane left without saying goodbye to his host. That was the first sign that the walls were already cracking. At night, alone with my thoughts, I let myself feel what I spent the daylight hours suppressing. Fear was not the right word. It was something colder. A deep, ancient exhaustion that came not from my own life alone, but from every life that had been lived and lost in places exactly like this one. I thought about my mother. I thought about Ezra's hollow eyes. I thought about the men in Lumpkin's alley who wept quietly into straw. And I asked myself the question that had followed me for years, like a shadow with no source. Was I truly free inside, the way I had always told myself? Or had I simply built a more sophisticated cage and called it dignity? The answer terrified me more than Harrison Whitmore ever could, because I didn't know. And not knowing meant that everything I had built my purpose upon might be standing on the same unstable ground as the man I had come to dismantle. 3 weeks into my time at the manor, Catherine summoned me to her sitting room. She was standing at the window when I entered, her back to me, watching the garden with the focused stillness of someone who is actually watching the door's reflection in the glass. She turned slowly and placed a folded piece of paper on the small table between us. She didn't explain it. She didn't need to. I unfolded it carefully. It was a list of names, 12 names, written in a hand I didn't recognize, each one followed by a date and a dollar amount. Below the last name, a single sentence in different ink, darker and pressed harder into the paper, read, "These men did not die free." I looked up at Catherine. Her expression was unreadable, but her hands were trembling slightly at her sides. Someone else knew what was buried under Whitmore land, and that someone had just decided to trust me with the proof. The following morning, 2 men arrived at the manor on horseback. They wore no uniforms, but they carried the particular stillness of men accustomed to violence as a professional tool. Harrison greeted them in the foyer with a handshake that lasted a second too long. The handshake of a man who needs something badly and is trying not to show it. I was instructed to bring refreshments to the study and to leave immediately after setting them down. I moved slowly. I heard enough. The men had been hired to locate a runaway, not from Whitmore land, but from the estate of the late Judge Pembroke, whose affairs were apparently now entangled with Harrison's in ways that made both families nervous. The name they were hunting was one I recognized. It was on Catherine's list. He wasn't a runaway. He was a witness. That evening I found Ezra in the stable, pretending to check the horses. His hands were shaking. I stood beside him in silence for a long moment before he spoke, barely above a breath, his eyes fixed on the middle distance. He told me the man they were hunting had come to the manor 2 nights before my arrival, had spoken to Catherine, had left something behind. Ezra didn't know what, but he knew that whatever it was, Catherine had not burned it. She had hidden it, and Harrison, Ezra believed, was beginning to suspect. I felt the temperature of everything shift in that moment. This was no longer simply a matter of one man's pride and one household's cruelty. There were forces gathering around this house from every direction. Creditors, hired men, buried truths clawing toward the surface. And I was standing at the exact center of all of it. It was Catherine who showed me where she had hidden it. 3 days after my conversation with Ezra, she led me to the library at midnight, candle in hand, moving through the dark hallway with the quiet certainty of a woman who had rehearsed this moment many times in her mind before finally committing to it. Behind a false panel beneath the 3rd shelf, behind volumes of Virginia land law that no one had opened in years, was a leather satchel. Inside it, deeds, original land deeds dating back to 1831, bearing the signatures of free black landowners who had legally purchased and registered their properties in Richmond County. Properties that now, somehow, bore the Whitmore name. Beside the deeds were death certificates, signed by the same physician, dated within days of each transfer. 12 men, 12 properties, 12 deaths that the official record called natural, that the trembling handwriting on a hidden piece of paper called something else entirely. In that moment, everything I had observed since arriving at the manor snapped into alignment with the precision of a key turning in a lock. Harrison's desperate need for visible wealth, the creditors circling, Aldrich Kane's urgent whispers about untenable positions, Catherine's nightly burnings, not of evidence against her husband, but of correspondence from people who were getting too close to the truth, the hired men searching for a witness, Ezra's hollow, surviving eyes. The Whitmore fortune had not been built on cotton or tobacco or the ordinary brutalities of Southern commerce. It had been built on murder, systematic, documented, carefully buried murder of free men whose only crime was owning land that someone more powerful wanted. And Harrison didn't just know. Harrison had inherited the method, and somewhere in the years since, he had continued it. The man who bought me to save his reputation had far darker debts than money to repay. I stood in that library for a long time after Catherine took the candle and left me alone with the satchel. The weight of what I held in my hands was not paper and leather. It was the compressed suffering of 12 men and every person who had ever loved them. I had 2 paths in front of me, and neither one was clean. I could take the documents to the Federal Circuit Court in Washington, a journey that would require me to move through hostile territory as a man legally classified as property, carrying evidence that powerful people in 3 counties would kill to suppress. Or I could use what I knew the way I had always used information, carefully, surgically, from the inside, and dismantle Harrison Whitmore the way you dismantle any structure built on lies, by removing the foundations one by one until the whole thing collapses under its own weight. The first path might save the record. The second path might save more lives. I could not do both. I chose the inside. And in making that choice, I finally understood something about myself that I had spent years carefully avoiding. I was not simply a man who had survived by being strategic. I was a man who had learned to love the architecture of justice more than the spectacle of it, who believed that the most devastating thing you could do to a system built on deception was not to attack it loudly from the outside, but to become the truth it could not contain. I went to Harrison the following morning. I told him, calmly, over his breakfast, that I knew about the deeds, that I knew about the physician, that I knew about all 12 names. I watched the color leave his face like water draining from a basin. And then I told him what I wanted. Not money, not papers, not freedom in the way he understood the word. I wanted him to confess, publicly, fully, before the weight of it killed him the way it had already begun to. Harrison came apart slowly, the way old houses do, not all at once, but in sequences, each collapse triggering the next. He spent 2 days locked in his study. On the 3rd day, Aldrich Kane arrived unannounced, and the shouting behind that door shook the crystal in the dining room cabinet. Catherine sat in her chair by the window and did not move, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on something only she could see. The hired men left without explanation. Ezra moved through the halls like a ghost who had just been told he was allowed to exist. And then, on the fourth morning, Harrison Whitmore walked out of his house in his best suit, crossed Grace Street on foot, and entered the offices of the Richmond Examiner. I watched from the upstairs window. My heart was not pounding. It was steady, steadier than it had ever been, beating with the slow, ancient rhythm of something that had waited a very long time to finally be witnessed. The confession ran in print 2 days later. It was incomplete. Lawyers had carved out the sharpest edges, but it was enough. The Whitmore name collapsed within a week. Creditors seized the manor. 3 associated families began their own quiet unravelings as the threads Harrison pulled on the way down took others with him. The deeds were submitted to the circuit court by Catherine herself, who had apparently made her own calculations and chosen her own path through the wreckage. 2 of the 12 families received formal acknowledgement of their claims. Not justice, not restoration, but acknowledgement, which in 1855 Virginia was a thing so rare it carried its own specific weight. Ezra walked out of the servants' entrance on a Thursday afternoon with a small bag and did not look back. I watched him go from the garden gate. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't need to. Some silences between people carry more than words ever could. I left Richmond on a gray September morning. Fog sitting low over the James River, like the city was finally exhaling something it had held in its lungs for decades. I carried nothing but the clothes on my back and the knowledge of what I had done and what I had chosen not to do. I have thought about those 12 men every day since. I have thought about my mother on that red dirt road. I have thought about Ezra's hollow eyes and Catherine's trembling hands, and the way Harrison Whitmore looked at me that first morning on his porch steps, like I was something he could own. Here is what I know now, standing on the other side of all of it. The most dangerous thing a man can carry into a room full of people who have decided he is less than human is the absolute, unshakable certainty that he is not. That certainty cannot be auctioned, cannot be confiscated, cannot be burned in a late-night fireplace. It was mine before Richmond. It is mine still, and no hammer anywhere will ever change that.